He was young, strong, full of life. And yet, something inside him was quietly destroying everything. Doctors didn't understand it. His body was collapsing. But there was no clear enemy to fight. In the early 1980s, fear began to spread across hospitals in the United States. Patients with rare infections, unusual cancers, a pattern no one had seen before. They called it a mystery. Some called it a death sentence. But what if this story didn't begin in the 1980s? What if the real origin of this disease goes back decades, hidden in silence, waiting to be discovered? What we now know as acquired immunodeficiency syndrome is not just a disease, it is the final stage of a much deeper biological story. A story that begins with a virus, human immunodeficiency virus, a virus that slowly weakens the immune system, turning the body against itself. For years, scientists searched for answers. Where did it come from? How did it spread so fast? And why did it seem to appear out of nowhere? The truth, however, was far more unsettling than anyone expected. Long before modern cities, before global travel, before anyone had a name for this disease, the virus already existed. Not in humans, but in animals. Deep in the rainforests of Central Africa, a silent chain of events had already begun. This is not just the story of a virus. This is a story about human choices, hidden connections, and the fragile boundary between nature and civilization. And once you see how it all began, you will never look at it the same way again. The corridor smells like antiseptic and fear. Fluorescent lights flicker overhead, casting a cold, lifeless glow across pale hospital walls. A young man struggles to breathe, his chest rising in shallow, uneven bursts. Just weeks ago, he was healthy, active, alive. Now, his body is collapsing in ways no one can explain. Nurses move quickly, but their eyes betray something deeper uncertainty. Doctors gather at the foot of his bed, flipping through charts, whispering in hushed tones. The symptoms don't make sense. Rare infections, collapsing immunity, aggressive cancers that shouldn't exist in someone his age. Medicine, for all its advancements, suddenly feels powerless. One question hangs in the air, unspoken but heavy. What are we dealing with? Across the United States, similar cases begin to emerge. Los Angeles, New York, San Francisco, young men, unexplained illnesses. The media starts to notice. Headlines grow louder, more alarming. A new term begins to circulate: gay cancer. Fear spreads faster than facts. And in the absence of answers, speculation fills the void. Inside the Centers for Disease Control and Prevention, scientists scramble to connect the dots. Reports pile up. Patterns begin to form, but nothing is certain. This isn't just a medical anomaly. It's something new, something unseen. And whatever it is, it's spreading. He was young, healthy, and suddenly dying. But here's the part no one understood at the time. This wasn't the beginning. Not even close. Because while the world was just starting to notice, the real story had already been unfolding for decades, hidden in silence. So the question is no longer what is happening, but when did it truly begin? But what if this story didn't begin in the 1980s? By the time the world gave it a name, the damage had already begun. But here's what most people didn't realize. AIDS is not the beginning of the story. It is the end stage, the final collapse of a system that has been quietly under attack for years. What doctors were seeing in the 1980s wasn't the cause, it was the consequence. The real story begins with something far more invisible. A virus, a microscopic entity that doesn't kill quickly, but patiently dismantles the body's defenses from within. Scientists would later call it human immunodeficiency virus, a name that would become one of the most feared in modern history. HIV doesn't destroy the body directly. Instead, it targets the immune system, the very mechanism designed to protect us. It infiltrates, replicates, and slowly weakens the body's ability to fight back. For years, a person can appear completely normal. No symptoms, no warning signs. Until one day, the immune system collapses, and that's when it becomes acquired immunodeficiency syndrome. AIDS doesn't start with AIDS. It starts with a virus. This single idea changes everything, because it means the real beginning of the crisis didn't happen in hospitals, or cities, or even in the modern world. It began long before anyone was watching, long before anyone had the tools to understand it. So now the question becomes deeper, more unsettling. If HIV was already spreading silently for years, decades, even then, where did it come from? How does a virus like this appear in humans without warning? And perhaps most disturbing of all, was this something we caused without even realizing it? Long before hospitals, before headlines, before fear had a name, the story begins in silence. Deep within the dense rainforests of Central Africa, life moves to an ancient rhythm untouched, unseen, and largely unexplored. Here, humans are not separate from nature. They are part of it, hunting, surviving, adapting. And hidden within this ecosystem, a virus has existed for thousands of years, completely unnoticed by the modern world. That virus is known today as simian immunodeficiency virus. It lives inside primates, especially chimpanzees, without causing the same devastating effects seen in humans. In its natural host, it is stable, balanced, almost invisible. But viruses are unpredictable, and sometimes all it takes is the smallest disruption to change everything. Before HIV infected humans, it lived quietly inside chimpanzees. For generations, hunters in these forests relied on what is known as bushmeat, wild animals hunted for food. It was survival, routine, necessary. But during the process of hunting and butchering, something critical could happen. Blood-to-blood contact, a cut on the skin, an open wound, a microscopic transfer no one could see and no one could stop. One cut, one moment. That's all it takes. Somewhere in that forest, at some point in the early 20th century, or perhaps even earlier, a hunter may have come into direct contact with infected blood. In that moment, the virus crossed a boundary it had never crossed before, from animal to human. But crossing over wasn't enough. To survive, it had to adapt, evolve, transform into something new. What makes this moment so unsettling is how ordinary it was. No explosion, no warning, no dramatic event. Just a routine act of survival. And yet, from that single interaction, a chain reaction may have begun, one that would eventually reach cities, cross continents, and alter the course of human history. The question is, how did it go from one person to millions? If there was a first human, no one saw it happen. No alarm was triggered. No record was written. Somewhere, quietly and invisibly, the virus made its first successful leap, and then it stayed. Scientists now believe this moment likely occurred in the early 20th century, around the 1920s, in what is now Kinshasa, a growing colonial city where trade, movement, and human contact were rapidly increasing. The first human infection likely happened decades before anyone noticed. This changes the timeline completely, because it means that while the world was living through wars, revolutions, and technological breakthroughs, a silent infection was already spreading beneath the surface, not rapidly, not explosively, but steadily moving from person to person, unnoticed, untracked, and completely misunderstood. For decades, people searched for a single origin point, a name, a face, someone to blame. And eventually, the media thought it had found one. Gaëtan Dugas, a French-Canadian flight attendant, linked to multiple early cases in North America. He was labeled Patient Zero, the man who started it all. But the truth was far more complicated and far more unsettling. Later research revealed that this label was based on a misunderstanding, a misinterpretation of data. By the time Dugas was identified, the virus had already been circulating for years, possibly decades. He wasn't the source. He wasn't the beginning. He was simply visible in a system that had been invisible for far too long. He wasn't the beginning. He was just part of the story. And that realization forces a deeper, more uncomfortable truth. There is no single first patient we can point to. No moment where everything clearly began. Instead, there is a network of early infections, spreading quietly through communities, long before science had the tools to detect it. So if there was no single beginning, what allowed it to grow? What turned a hidden infection into a global crisis? By the time the virus had crossed into humans, it didn't need a traumatic event to survive. It needed opportunity. And the early 20th century provided exactly that. Colonial Africa was changing rapidly. Small settlements were transforming into growing urban centers. Among them, Kinshasa became a hub of movement, trade, and human interaction. For the first time, large numbers of people were living closer together than ever before. Railways cut through dense forests, connecting remote regions to expanding cities. Rivers became highways. Workers traveled long distances. Traders moved constantly. And with them, something invisible moved too. Not in waves, not in outbreaks, but quietly person to person, contact by contact. A slow-burning transmission that left no immediate trace. The virus didn't explode. It spread quietly, invisibly. But there was another factor, one far more unexpected. Medical campaigns designed to help may have unintentionally accelerated the spread. In efforts to fight diseases like sleeping sickness, colonial health workers administered injections to thousands of people. But sterilization practices were often limited. Needles were reused again and again. In that process, blood wasn't just treated, it was shared. At the same time, social structures were shifting. Migration increased. Labor systems separated families. In rapidly growing cities, informal economies emerged, including sex work. Networks of human contact became denser, more complex, and more connected than ever before. The virus didn't need to change its behavior. The world around it had already changed enough. What makes this phase so difficult to understand is its silence. No sudden spike, no clear outbreak. Just a gradual expansion, hidden within ordinary human life. By the time patterns could have been recognized, it was already too late. The virus had moved beyond isolated communities. It was no longer local. It was becoming something much bigger. The question now is, when did it cross the border into the wider world? For decades, the virus remained largely contained within Central Africa, moving quietly, building strength, adapting with every transmission. But isolation doesn't last forever. By the mid-20th century, the world was becoming more connected than ever before. Air travel expanded. International labor increased. And in that growing web of global movement, the virus found its next path. One of the most critical and often overlooked links in this chain was Haiti. In the 1960s, professionals from Haiti traveled to Central Africa, particularly to places like Kinshasa, as part of post-colonial development efforts. Teachers, technicians, workers. When they returned home, they didn't just bring experience back with them. In some cases, they may have unknowingly carried the virus across continents. From Haiti, the virus found a new gateway. Trade routes, tourism, migration. By the early 1970s, it had likely reached the United States, entering silently, without detection. No alarms, no screenings, no understanding of what was coming. It didn't arrive as a known threat. It arrived as something invisible. By the time the world noticed, it was already everywhere, By the time doctors in cities like Los Angeles and New York began reporting unusual cases, the virus had already established itself within multiple communities. It wasn't spreading randomly. It was moving through networks of human connection. And because it could remain undetected for years, every new infection silently extended its reach. What makes this moment so critical is not just that the virus spread, but how perfectly the world allowed it to spread. Faster travel, denser cities, more connections than ever before. The conditions were ideal, and the virus didn't need to accelerate. It simply followed the paths we had already created. The question now is no longer how it spread, but why no one saw it coming. By the early 1980s, the pattern was no longer invisible, it was terrifying. Hospitals in major cities were seeing the same symptoms again and again. Young patients, collapsing immune systems, rare infections that should have been easily contained. But instead of clarity, what emerged first was fear, raw, unfiltered, and dangerously misdirected. The media needed a name, a label, something people could understand or fear. And so, a phrase began to spread, gay plague. It was simple, it was shocking, and it was deeply misleading. Because while many early cases were identified within gay communities, the virus itself did not discriminate. But the narrative had already taken hold. Communities were stigmatized. Patients were isolated, not just medically, but socially. Fear turned into blame, and blame turned into silence. Many people avoided testing. Others hid their symptoms. Because in a world driven by misunderstanding, being sick didn't just mean being at risk, it meant being judged. Inside the Centers for Disease Control and Prevention, scientists were racing against time. Data was incomplete. The virus itself hadn't even been fully identified yet. But cases were increasing, and without clear answers, public fear began to fill the gaps faster than science could. Fear spread faster than the virus itself, and in many ways, that fear made everything worse. It delayed understanding. It slowed response. It fractured trust between communities and institutions. Because while the virus remained invisible, the consequences of fear were impossible to ignore. The question now was no longer just how to stop the disease, but how to confront the damage already done by misinformation. For years, the virus moved faster than understanding. It spread in silence while scientists struggled in the dark, trying to define something they couldn't yet see. But then, slowly, the tide began to turn. Laboratories across the world intensified their efforts. The unknown was no longer acceptable. The race had begun not just to understand the disease, but to stop it. In the early 1980s, two separate research teams made a breakthrough that would change everything. One led by Montagnier in France, and another by Robert Gallo in the United States. Both groups identified the same underlying cause, a retrovirus that attacked the human immune system. For the first time, the invisible enemy had a face. Once identified, everything accelerated. Blood tests were developed. Transmission pathways became clearer. The fear, while still present, was no longer directionless. Science had given it structure, and with structure came strategy. Researchers began working on treatments ways to slow the virus, to interrupt its life cycle, to give patients something they had never had before: time. For the first time, humanity began to fight back. The introduction of antiretroviral therapies marked a turning point. What was once considered a certain death sentence began to transform into a manageable condition. Patients who were once given months were now living years, even decades. It wasn't a cure, but it was hope. And hope changed everything. But even as science advanced, one truth remained. The virus was still out there, still evolving, still spreading in parts of the world where access to treatment was limited. The battle was no longer just scientific. It was global, social, and deeply human. The question now was not just how to fight the virus, but how to outpace it. When you trace the story back to its earliest point, there is no single explosion, no clear starting line, no dramatic moment where everything suddenly changed. Instead, there is a long, fragile chain of events. A virus moving between species, a single unnoticed transmission, a growing city, expanding travel routes, human decisions made without knowing their consequences. What we call acquired immunodeficiency syndrome is not a moment in time, it is a process shaped by biology, environment, and human behavior all at once. It doesn't belong to one country, one person, or one event. It belongs to history itself. A history written quietly, long before the world had the language to describe it. At its core, this story is not only about a virus. It is about connection, about how closely human progress and human vulnerability are tied together. Cities bring opportunity, but also exposure. Movement creates growth, but also risk. And sometimes, the same systems that advance civilization also carry its most unexpected consequences. AIDS didn't begin with a single person. It began with a chain of moments. And perhaps that is the most important truth of all. There is no single villain, no single mistake, no single origin point we can isolate and blame. Instead, there is a complex intersection of nature and humanity colliding quietly over decades, until the world could no longer ignore it. The story of AIDS is not just a medical history. It is a reminder that in a connected world, nothing exists in isolation, not viruses, not societies, not consequences. And if there is one lesson buried inside this entire story, it is this: the smallest events, when linked together, can reshape the entire course of human life. If you watched this far, you didn't just see a story, you experienced a chain of events that shaped modern history. If this kind of deep, cinematic storytelling matters to you, make sure to subscribe and join this journey. There are many more hidden stories waiting to be uncovered. If this documentary gave you a new perspective, leave a like and share your thoughts in the comments. Your ideas help shape the next stories we tell here. What should we uncover next? And don't forget to watch the next episode, because some of the most important stories in human history are still hidden, waiting just beneath the surface. Take care of yourself, stay curious, and most importantly, stay healthy.